The deployment of the Uganda's People Defense Forces troops in South Sudan to supposedly assist the South Sudanese People Defense Forces in fighting the White Army and SPLA-IO forces in the country is a violation of the arms embargo that was imposed on South Sudan by the United Nations. This is a report that has been released by an international humanitarian body denoting that the UPDF has committed a crime by assisting the South Sudanese Defense Forces in the war that is continuing in the country. In this video as well, I'm going to tell you about the use of attack helicopters that have been used in South Sudan in fighting the White Army and the SPLA-IO forces. We have heard about these helicopters, and it turns out that these helicopters were to be grounded since 2020, but a violation again now by the South Sudanese Defense Forces and the South Sudanese government, a violation of the arms embargo enabled these helicopters to be out in public and firing against the supposed aggressors of the nation, as well as the innocent victims that have lost their lives because of this upscale of violence in South Sudan. Well, this is bona fide. If you haven't subscribed, kindly subscribe and hit that notification button so that when I release something new on the South Sudan crisis, you get notified as soon as possible. Well, South Sudan went into a civil war for 5 years. And after 5 years, the two major parties that were contributing in this fight in South Sudan went to a table and signed the revitalized agreement, agreed to cease hostilities between each other and form a government of unity. Now, in 2018, there was an arms embargo that was imposed on South Sudan just to make sure that there is no continuation of hostilities or fighting in the country. The 2018 arms embargo banned all arms sales and military transfers to South Sudan with limited exceptions. And that meant that there will be no supply of weapons to the South Sudanese Defense Forces or to any other faction in South Sudan for military purposes. It meant that there will be no any kind of military support from any country, any company in South Sudan. That was imposed by the United Nations. Now, as Amnesty International has put out, that there is a flagrant violation of the arms embargo that was set by the United Nations Security Council. It means that any entity that would like to supply military equipment to South Sudan will need to go through the proper channels, and that meant that they will have to seek permission from the United Nations Security Council itself for them to continue to supply South Sudan with weapons or any other military assistance. But what happened just about 2 months ago? The Uganda's People Defense Forces went into South Sudan. That is what now Amnesty International is calling the military support. The arms embargo bans all military support. That can be through troops, it can be through arms and weapons and armored personnel carriers. It means that South Sudanese Defense Forces were not supposed to get any kind of military assistance. But the Uganda's People Defense Forces went into South Sudan, and they said that this was at the request of the President Salva Kiir. And the Uganda's parliament went into a sitting and discussed and permitted their troops to go into South Sudan so that they can assist the South Sudanese Defense Forces. Well, there have been conflicting reasons given by the Uganda's People Defense Forces for them to go into South Sudan. At first, they say that they were not there to act as a buffer zone between the two warring sides. They say that they are there solely to assist President Salva Kiir and his troops in fighting the aggressors in the country. At that time, you understand that all this started in Nasir County, where there was a shootdown of that helicopter and the general died, and some of the UN personnel also died in that particular attack. And that is when the Ugandan forces came in. They say that they are there specifically to support the South Sudanese People Defense Forces in fighting the aggressors. Well, right now, what we can see or what we can read in the website of the UPDF is that they are there to maintain peace, law, and order, meaning that they are there not to solely assist the South Sudanese People Defense Forces. They are there to act as a buffer zone between the two warring sides so that they can maintain peace. That someone can say, or someone can argue, that is the role of UNMISS, the United Nations Mission in South Sudan. It is actively in South Sudan has been renewed year after year so that it can make sure that both of these warring parties do not end up in conflict. The situation right now in South Sudan is worse than it was just months ago because there is active fighting in different parts of the country. The UPDF is now actively involved, and as you can read even on your screen right now, the military commanders and the general of the UPDF have been there. They've been saying that we have achieved this and this from South Sudan. Even the president himself said that this is what the Ugandan Civil Defense Forces has achieved in South Sudan. Well, this kind of assistance is now what the Amnesty International is saying that it was a violation of the arms embargo that was imposed on South Sudan. And it goes further to say that the use of attack helicopters that have been widely used by the South Sudanese People Defense Forces, mostly in these places that have been designated to be hostile regions against the aggressors. And of course, many innocents have also lost their lives because of the helicopter attacks that have been happening in South Sudan. You remember, just a few days ago, there was that attack in Old Fangak against the hospital, the Doctors Without Borders Hospital, and many patients lost their lives in that particular attack. There have been other attacks by helicopters in South Sudan, and something very, very interesting is that by 2020, all these helicopters were grounded. Why? Because they did not have the required spare parts to continue operating in South Sudan. And when you're talking about this arms embargo, it means that even the spare parts of this military equipment were banned from going into South Sudan. Now, when you're seeing these helicopters up in the air, attacking different positions in the country, it means that in one way or another, these spare parts made their way into South Sudan and they went into the South Sudanese Defense Forces that have enabled these helicopters now to go up in the air and to conduct these attacks that have been conducted in different positions in South Sudan. This means that the South Sudanese Defense Forces or the South Sudanese government is also accused of directly violating the arms embargo that was installed by the United Nations Security Council. Now, there have been other calls by the African Union, IGAD, the UN, and other bodies, including nations, Western nations, calling the South Sudanese government and President Salva Kiir to ensure the release of the detained officials of the opposition party so that there can be a dialogue and the return of the peace from the revitalized agreement. Now, this is the latest of what is happening in South Sudan in this recent crisis. Of course, the people who are suffering the most are the innocent civilians, children, women, and men who are not directly involved in this fighting that is ongoing in the country. Well, I will keep you informed of the latest of what is happening in South Sudan. Keep it bona fide.